Rain slammed against the corrugated iron roof of the shack with the force of gravel thrown by a giant. Every impact sent a shudder through the rusted metal sheets, vibrating the frame of the structure until the walls groaned in protest. Water did not just fall, it sought entry. A hairline crack in the ceiling widened under the pressure, and a steady, rhythmic drip began to pool on the hard-packed dirt floor. Outside, the streets of Maputo had vanished beneath a churning sheet of gray water and wind. The air inside the shack thickened with the scent of damp earth and trapped humidity. A single cooking pot sat near the center of the room, catching the leak with a hollow, metallic ping that echoed against the silence of the room. The wind howled through the gaps in the timber, whistling a sharp, discordant note that cut through the thunder. Everything within the shack was cold, slick with moisture, and trembling under the relentless assault of the night. There was no escape from the deluge, only the grim patience of waiting for the storm to break. Juma retreated from the center of the room, his movements slow and deliberate to conserve what little energy he possessed. He sat heavily on a wooden crate, his knees pulled tight against his chest. A sharp, cramping pain tightened his stomach muscles, forcing him to hunch forward. He pressed his palms deep into his midsection, trying to suppress the ache that had become his only constant companion. Beneath the thin fabric of his shirt, his ribs traced a jagged outline against his skin, rising and falling with every shallow, labored breath he took. He stared at the empty cooking pots near the leaking roof, but they offered nothing. The hunger was not merely an emptiness. It was a physical weight that made his head swim and his vision blur at the edges. He tried to swallow, but his throat felt like dry parchment. He reached up to trace the sharp angle of his collarbone, his fingers trembling with a fatigue that had seeped into his very marrow. He remained anchored to the spot, trapped by the sheer exhaustion of a body that had long ago exhausted its last reserves of strength. Mama Juma sat on a low, unsteady stool just feet away. Her eyes remained fixed on the center of the room, tracking the relentless rhythm of the water dripping from the ceiling. She shifted her weight, and the wood groaned under her. She raised her hands into the dim light. They were thick with calluses, the skin mapped with deep, permanent creases earned from decades of unforgiving labor. She did not speak. The thunder outside rendered words useless. Instead, she moved with a slow, deliberate precision, lifting her right arm to point directly toward the heavy, rain-slicked wooden door. Her index finger remained steady, aimed at the threshold as if marking a destination. She looked at Juma, her gaze lingering on his hunched frame and the visible sharpness of his bones. She repeated the gesture, pushing her hand through the heavy air with a firm, downward motion. It was a command rooted in the reality of their survival. Juma watched the movement, his breath hitching in his chest. The silence between them grew heavy, punctuated only by the persistent tapping of the rain against the metal roof above. He understood. The time for waiting had reached its end. Juma pushed himself off the crate, his joints stiff. He walked to the door, placing his palm against the rough, damp timber. He pulled the latch back, and the wood groaned open. A wall of wind and water slammed into the opening, instantly chilling the air inside. He stepped across the threshold, and his boots plunged into a pool of standing water that surged over his ankles. The rain fell in heavy gray sheets, turning the ground into a shifting slurry of mud. He took a step, then another, his feet fighting the suction of the saturated earth. Every movement was a battle against the wind that whipped water into his eyes, forcing him to squint against the deluge. The street was empty, reduced to a dark ribbon of rushing runoff and slick debris. He waded forward, his shoulders hunched to guard against the cold. The storm drowned out every sound save for the rhythmic splashing of his boots and the relentless drumming of rain on the corrugated roofs above. He moved deeper into the dark, his silhouette shrinking against the vast, weeping horizon of the city, completely alone in the fury of the night. Juma veered away from the main road, seeking shelter against the jagged brick walls of a narrow corridor. The roar of the storm muffled here, replaced by the hollow dripping of water off eaves and the rhythmic splash of his own progress. He kept his head down, focused on the uneven ground, until his foot struck a loose stone. The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the confined space. He pulled up short, his breath catching as the air in front of him shifted. A density manifested in the darkness, a shape that did not belong to the urban decay. Juma strained to see, but the shadows were absolute. Then, The shape moved. A figure detached itself from the wall, stepping directly into the center of the narrow path. It stood motionless, feet planted firmly to block any forward movement. The streetlights from the distant main avenue cast no light into this pocket of the city. Juma stopped, his boots grinding into the slick mud. He shifted his weight, preparing to pivot, but the figure mimicked the movement with predatory precision. There was no escape forward. He stood trapped, the rain still cascading around them, while the stranger loomed in the silence, waiting for Juma to acknowledge the confrontation. The stranger did not speak. He raised his hands, the movement slow and deliberate, and reached into the darkness of his own shadow. Juma leaned back, his heart thumping against his ribs, but his feet remained rooted to the muddy ground. From the folds of the man's heavy layers, a metallic object emerged. It was small, rectangular, and possessed a weight that seemed to anchor it in the air. The man stepped forward, closing the final gap. He grabbed Juma's hand and forced his fingers to curl around the device. The surface felt unnaturally cold, a sharp, biting chill that seeped instantly into Juma's palm, numbing his skin. Juma gasped, looking up to demand an explanation, but the space where the man had stood was already vacating. The figure began to lose its edge, blurring into the gray, swirling mist that choked the alley. Within seconds, the outline dissolved entirely, scattering into the damp air like smoke in a gale. Juma stood alone in the sudden, crushing silence. He looked down at his own hand. The device remained, solid and heavy, humming with a faint, rhythmic vibration that pulsed against his skin, completely out of place in the wet, dark decay of the alley. Juma retreated from the alley, his pace quickening until he reached the splintered door of his home. He pushed inside, the wood groaning against the frame. The shack was dim, illuminated only by the flickering light of the storm outside. He collapsed onto his stool, the heavy device still gripped in his palm. It felt colder now, the metal biting into his skin. He set it on the scarred table. Silence stretched across the room, broken only by the steady drum of rain against the corrugated roof. He looked at the device, then at the empty, rusted pots lining his wall. His stomach cramped, a sharp, familiar pain. He leaned forward, his voice barely a breath. "Bread," he whispered, the words sounding fragile in the small space. He held his breath, waiting for the absurdity of the moment to pass. Then, a sharp knock rattled the door. Juma froze. He reached out, his hand trembling, and pushed the latch. The door swung wide. Resting on the threshold, steaming in the cool night air, sat a fresh, crusty loaf of bread. The scent of yeast and warmth filled the room, replacing the smell of damp earth. Juma stared, his disbelief hardening into a sudden, frantic hope. Juma set the bread aside, his hands still shaking. The device sat on the table, its surface now glowing with a soft, rhythmic light that pulsed like a heartbeat. He reached out, his fingertip hovering just millimeters above the glass. He had lived his entire life counting pennies, measuring every grain of rice, and watching the bottom of the pot. He pressed the screen. It didn't feel like glass. It felt like warm liquid beneath his touch. A menu bloomed, bright and sharp against the gloom of the shack. He navigated to the account summary. The screen flickered, the numbers cycling through a rapid blur of movement. 0. The digit held for a heartbeat, then vanished. A new string of numbers began to climb, faster and faster, scrolling upward until they hit a sum that made his vision swim. He blinked, thinking he had misread the decimal point. He tapped again. The figure remained, solid and undeniable. It was more money than he had ever seen. More than his entire neighborhood would earn in a lifetime. He pulled his hand back as if burned, staring at the glowing display. The shack seemed to shrink around him, the walls suddenly feeling too thin, too temporary for the massive change now locked into the screen. The weight of the numbers on the screen changed the way Juma moved. He stood, his joints stiff from years of labor, and walked to the cracked mirror hanging by the door. He looked at himself, then turned his gaze toward the pile of new arrivals that had appeared in the corner of the room. He reached for the fabric, feeling the dense, heavy weave between his fingers. It was a texture he had never encountered, cool and smooth. He pulled the material over his shoulders, the fit precise, changing his silhouette instantly. He adjusted the cuffs, his movements deliberate. He stared into the glass again, but the man looking back was no longer the one who counted pennies in the dark. He tested the tension of the fabric, feeling the sharp lines it created. A sense of permanence settled over him. He walked to the center of the room, turning slowly, feeling the drape of the new materials against his skin. Every motion felt heavier, more intentional. He smoothed the front, his palms pressing against the firm, clean surface. The shack felt smaller than ever, its rough walls pressing inward against his new presence. He grabbed the phone from the table, tucked it away, and walked toward the door, leaving the old, worn items in a heap on the floor. The iron gates groaned as they swung inward, revealing a driveway of white stone that stretched toward a structure of glass and marble. Juma stepped out of the vehicle, his boots clicking sharply against the polished surface. The silence here was thick, heavy, and entirely alien. He walked toward the main entrance, his hand hovering over the handle before he pushed. The door swung open with effortless grace. Inside, the ceiling soared upward, disappearing into shadow. He paced across the floor, his footfalls echoing through the vast, empty halls. He reached out to touch a marble pillar, the stone icy and unyielding under his palm. He moved into the main living space, where floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city lights. He waited for the sounds of his old neighborhood, the shouting, the cooking, the persistent hum of life, but heard only the faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock somewhere deep in the house. He sat on a wide, cushioned chair, the fabric yielding perfectly to his weight. He looked at his hands, then back at the expansive, vacant room. The scale of the space felt like a physical pressure. He was surrounded by everything he had ever wanted, yet the silence was absolute. He stared out at the city below, realizing that the distance between his past and this present was not just physical, but total. By the third day, the air in the city markets changed. Juma walked through the central plaza, and the usual roar of commerce dipped into a low, rhythmic murmur as he passed. People stopped their haggling. Vendors leaned over their stalls, eyes tracking his path. He heard his name spoken in fragments, a sharp syllable here, a questioning tone there. The rumors were no longer just whispers. They were becoming a physical force. He stopped to buy a piece of fruit, and the vendor refused his payment, bowing slightly instead. The exchange was heavy with unspoken questions. Juma pulled back, his pulse quickening. He turned into a side street, hoping for anonymity, but the sensation of being watched followed him. Shadows shifted in alleyways, heads turned in unison from storefronts. He realized the city was no longer a place of familiar routine, but a stage where every movement was scrutinized. He reached the corner and glanced back. A group of men stood near the fountain, their heads tilted together, their gazes fixed firmly on his back. He quickened his pace, his boots striking the pavement with sudden urgency. The city had found its new center, and it was demanding answers he was not ready to give. The ballroom doors opened, and a wall of sound hit Juma like a physical wave. Clinking glass, low-frequency laughter, and the rhythmic shuffle of hundreds of feet on polished marble. He paused at the threshold, his hand instinctively reaching toward his side. A guard stepped forward, palm raised, demanding a gesture of recognition. Juma fumbled for the invitation, his fingers stiff. The guard scrutinized the paper, then gestured for him to move into the light. The room was immense, lit by chandeliers that cast sharp, angular shadows across the floor. He stepped inside, and the ambient noise seemed to shift. Conversations didn't stop, but they slowed. Heads turned. The proximity of so many people, each moving with a practiced, fluid ease, made him feel rigid. He walked toward the perimeter, keeping his back to the wall. The air smelled of expensive wine and cold metal. He watched the crowd, people leaning in, whispering, hands moving in synchronized patterns. He stood on the edge of the movement, a spectator in a world that operated on rules he hadn't learned. He scanned the room, searching for a single point of stability, but every face he met turned away or hardened into a mask of polite indifference. He was inside the gates, yet further from home than he had ever been. Juma shifted his weight, his heels clicking sharply against the stone floor. He needed an exit, a quiet hallway, anything to escape the suffocating weight of the room. He turned toward the far archway, but his movement halted. Across the expanse of the hall, a woman stood by a pillar. She was not looking at the musicians, nor the dancers. She was looking directly at him. Her gaze was not the flicker of curiosity he had seen from others. It was focused, immovable, and entirely devoid of the pretense that filled the room. Juma tried to glance away, to lose himself in the shifting crowd, but her eyes held him. He felt the space between them compress. She pushed off from the pillar and began to walk. She did not weave or pause to greet others. She moved with a directness that carved a path through the throng. People stepped aside as she approached, the rhythm of their chatter faltering in her wake. Juma stood his ground, his hands clenching at his sides. He felt the air grow thin. She stopped only a few feet away, her presence anchoring the chaos of the room into a singular, silent point. She did not blink. She simply watched him, and in that gaze, Juma felt the polished surface of his new life begin to crack. The music in the room seemed to dampen, muffled by the intensity of her focus. Alima shifted her head slightly, her gaze never breaking contact with his. She did not lean in, nor did she retreat. She waited until the surrounding chatter had fully faded from his consciousness. "Everything here," she said, her voice low and steady. "The house, the car, the reputation it appeared in the span of a single night. How did you build an empire while the rest of the city slept?" The question hung in the air, stripped of any social pleasantry. Juma felt his throat tighten. He opened his mouth to offer a rehearsed response, a practiced deflection about luck or timing, but the words died before they could escape. Her eyes were mirrors, reflecting the sudden, hollow reality of his situation. He looked around, suddenly aware of the distance between himself and every other person in the hall. He was a ghost inhabiting a space he did not own. He took a sharp breath, his fingers twitching against his palms. The polished floor felt unstable beneath his boots. She did not press for an answer, yet her silence demanded one with more force than any accusation. Juma looked down, then back at her, unable to hide the cracks in his composure. The heavy glass doors of the gala swung shut behind them, cutting off the rhythmic thrum of the music. The air outside was cool, tasting of salt and wet sand. Juma walked toward the shoreline, his pace jagged and uneven, but Alima matched his stride without effort. They crossed the dunes, the ground shifting under their weight. Juma kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, his hands buried deep in his pockets, trying to maintain the distance he had perfected over the past few weeks. But the tide was coming in, its steady, repetitive roar filling the empty space between them. He stopped. He felt the cold water wash over the tips of his boots, pulling the sand away from beneath his heels. He looked at Alima. She was watching the dark water, her posture relaxed, completely unbothered by the silence that had felt so suffocating inside. She leaned down, picked up a smooth stone, and skipped it across the surface. It clicked against the water 3 times before sinking. Juma watched the ripples fade into the black. For the first time, he did not feel the need to construct a narrative or justify his presence. He simply stood there, letting the cold wind strip away the artificial weight of his recent life. They began to walk again, their footprints side by side in the damp earth, moving away from the lights of the city. The transition from the salt air to the climate-controlled silence of the restaurant felt jarring. Crystal glasses caught the low light, scattering sharp reflections across the white tablecloths. Juma sat opposite Alima, the heavy silverware cold beneath his fingertips. Around them, the city elite murmured in hushed tones, their laughter polished and rehearsed. A waiter arrived, placing a plate of delicate, intricate food before them, but Juma barely glanced at the meal. He watched Alima instead. She moved with a natural grace that made the surrounding luxury look like a stage set. When she spoke, the ambient noise of the room seemed to recede, leaving only the sound of her voice. He reached for his water, his hands steady, finally identifying the source of his persistent unease. The grandeur of the restaurant, the gold leaf trim, the velvet chairs, the expensive wine offered him no comfort. It was all a hollow accumulation of things. He looked back at Alima, finding the only anchor in his current life. He leaned forward, ignoring the waiter who hovered nearby, and let the rest of the world blur into a nameless background. For the first time, he felt the heavy burden of his manufactured success begin to slip away, replaced by the simple, singular weight of her attention. Outside the restaurant, the street was bathed in the harsh, flickering orange of sodium lamps. A black sedan sat idling in the shadows 50 yards down the block, its engine a low, rhythmic vibration against the pavement. Inside the cabin, Bosi Kasim watched the entrance. His knuckles were white, pressed so hard against the leather of the steering wheel that the skin looked translucent. He tracked Juma as he stepped onto the sidewalk, Alima close at his side. Every casual gesture Juma made, every smile shared, deepened the tension in the car. Kasim did not blink. He watched the way Juma navigated the crowd, a man who possessed a life Kasim felt belonged to him. The air inside the sedan grew stale, heavy with the scent of unlit tobacco and the sharp metallic tang of suppressed fury. Kasim shifted his weight, the leather seat groaning under the movement. He watched them move further into the city, his jaw set, his breathing ragged and shallow. The power Juma radiated was a physical affront. Kasim's grip tightened, the leather creaking under the strain, as he committed every detail of their path to memory. He was no longer just watching. He was calculating. Kasim did not turn his head when the passenger door opened. The cold night air rushed into the sedan, carrying the smell of wet asphalt. Musa slid into the seat, his presence silent and heavy. He waited for a command, his gaze fixed on the same distant figures Kasim had been stalking. Kasim pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lit it, and let the smoke drift against the windshield. He pointed toward the street where Juma and Alima had disappeared. His voice was a low scrape, barely audible over the idling engine. He gave the order with a sharp, downward gesture of his hand. Musa nodded once, his expression unchanged, and reached for the door handle. He stepped back out into the rain, moving with a deliberate, practiced ease that kept him tucked within the reach of the streetlights. He did not look back at the sedan. As Musa rounded the corner, the sedan stayed in place for another heartbeat, then pulled slowly into the lane. The hunt had moved from observation to pursuit. Musa kept his distance, his boots silent on the slick pavement, maintaining a steady, predatory rhythm that closed the gap between him and his target. Musa stayed 20 paces behind, his movements blending into the shifting crowds. He watched Juma navigate the bustling market district with an ease that betrayed his recent origins. Juma stopped at a stall, examining a display of goods, his hands moving over the items with a lingering curiosity. Musa ducked behind a stack of crates, his eyes fixed on the man's posture. He looked for a tell, a moment of hesitation, or a sign that Juma was guarding something of value. He watched Juma check his pockets, the way he shifted his weight, and the frequency with which he glanced toward his side. Musa moved again, stepping into the narrow space between two buildings to gain a better vantage point. The alley was damp, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat and exhaust. He adjusted his position, pressing his back against the rough brick wall. Juma turned to continue his walk, his pace steady, unaware of the shadow trailing him. Musa waited for the gap to widen, then pushed off the wall. He moved with a quiet, efficient stride, closing the distance just enough to keep Juma's silhouette within his line of sight. He was mapping the rhythm of Juma's life, waiting for the armor to show a crack. Juma retreated into the quiet of his study, locking the heavy door behind him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the antique phone, his fingers tracing the worn edges of the casing. The screen flickered with a faint, steady light, casting long shadows against the walls. He sat at the desk, his back to the window, completely absorbed in the device. He did not hear the soft scrape of a boot on the terrace outside. He tapped the surface, staring at the changing numbers as if they held the weight of his future. Outside, a shadow detached itself from the pillar and pressed closer to the glass. Musa watched, his breath leaving no fog on the pane, his eyes locked on the way Juma guarded the object. Juma stood up, paced the length of the room, and then returned to the desk, placing the phone squarely in the center of the wood. He moved to the side to pour a glass of water, turning his focus away for a mere second. The phone pulsed once, a sharp, rhythmic glow that illuminated the entire room. Musa gripped the handle of the window, his knuckles tightening, waiting for the latch to yield. Mama Juma walked through the hallway, her footsteps echoing against the polished marble floor. She stopped at the entrance of the grand dining room, staring at the long table that could seat 20. She did not enter. Instead, she traced the edge of a mahogany sideboard, her fingers hovering inches above the wood, as if the surface were too delicate to touch. Every room in the house felt like a museum, cold and unfamiliar. She turned away and walked toward the living area, where plush chairs stood arranged in perfect, rigid rows. She bypassed them entirely, feeling more at home standing near the heavy curtains that blocked the view of the city. She found a narrow alcove near the kitchen, a space that felt small enough to contain her presence without overwhelming it. She leaned against the wall, eyes fixed on the floor, waiting for the silence to pass. When she moved, she did so with a measured, careful gait, keeping her head low. The luxury around her offered no warmth. She sat on a small stool she had dragged into the corner, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the sunlight shift across the empty floorboards. Here, in the shadows of the expansive house, she felt the weight of their old life pressing against the new. Alima entered the library without knocking. She found Juma staring at the far wall, his hands restless, his focus fractured. She walked across the room, her boots silent on the rug, and stopped directly in front of him. She reached out and took his wrist, pulling his hand away from the desk. Juma started, his gaze shifting to hers, but he said nothing. Alima looked around the grand, empty space, then leaned closer. She spoke low, her voice steady and sharp. "Look at these walls. Look at the way people watch you in the street. This speed, this sudden arrival of everything we have, it is a beacon." She squeezed his wrist, her grip firm enough to leave a mark. "You think this life is a gift, but it is a target. The faster you climb, the more eyes you draw, and not all of them want to see you succeed." Juma tried to pull away, but she held firm. She pointed toward the window, toward the city lights that seemed to pulse with a predatory rhythm. "There are men who build empires through blood and iron. They do not tolerate newcomers who bypass their rules. You are playing a game with stakes you do not understand." She released him and stepped back, her expression unyielding. Juma turned to the window, the silence of the room suddenly heavy, suffocating. From the shadows of the alley, Bosi Kasim gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned pale. He watched the mansion through the rain-streaked windshield, his eyes tracking the movement of guards near the perimeter. He pulled a map from the passenger seat, tracing a line toward the rear entrance with a heavy, steady finger. He did not blink. A subordinate shifted in the seat beside him, but Kasim raised a hand, silencing the movement instantly. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a set of steel lockpicks, tossing them onto the dashboard with a sharp, metallic clatter. He leaned forward, his face inches from the glass, analyzing the rhythm of the security patrols. Greed dictated his posture. He sat rigid, his breathing shallow and controlled. He knew the wealth was not earned through traditional means, and that realization fueled a sharp, calculating hunger. He tapped the glass, pointing toward a blind spot in the estate's lighting. He spoke a single, low command, and the engine rumbled to life, the tires biting into the slick pavement. He was no longer observing. He was preparing to strike. He shifted the car into gear, his gaze locked on the target, calculating the precise moment to move before the light changed. Juma walked through the hallway, his footsteps echoing against the polished marble floor. He stopped at the heavy oak doors of the study and pushed them open. The room was warm, filled with the scent of old paper and wood polish. He moved to the desk, poured a glass of water, and took a long, slow swallow. He walked to each lamp in the room, turning the switches until the space was bathed in a dim, amber glow. He did not check the window locks. He did not scan the perimeter. He believed the walls were enough to hold back the world. He moved to the armchair by the fireplace, sat down, and let his head rest against the back of the seat. The house settled around him, the timbers groaning under the cooling night air. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving the grounds in a suffocating, unnatural silence. Juma stared at the dying embers in the grate, his breathing slowing until it matched the rhythm of the house. He reached out and placed his hand on the armrest, his fingers relaxing completely. He did not hear the engine idling at the edge of the property. He did not notice the shadows shifting near the garden wall. He simply closed his eyes, drifting into a heavy, unguarded sleep. The moon climbed high, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured gardens of the estate. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic chirping of crickets. Near the north gate, a single exterior floodlight flickered, buzzed with a sharp electrical crack. and plunged the surrounding flower beds into darkness. The transition was instantaneous. Musa emerged from the cover of the hedges, his movements fluid and practiced. He kept his body low, skirting the edge of the stone path where the moonlight could not reach. He reached the perimeter wall and pressed his palms against the rough granite, feeling for gaps in the mortar. He hoisted his weight, pulling himself upward with steady, calculated tension until his boots found a solid ledge. From this height, the mansion looked like a fortress of glass and silence. He scanned the second floor. One window remained partially unlatched, a thin sliver of darkness amidst the glowing facade. Musa dropped to the soft grass on the other side, his landing making no sound. He crouched behind a marble statue, waiting for the wind to shift. The air turned colder. He checked the distance to the terrace, his eyes fixed on the target window. He was no longer waiting. He was calculating the final approach. Musa reached the terrace, his boots silent on the cold stone tiles. He gripped the handle of the glass door, but it held firm. He pulled a thin metal shim from his pocket, sliding it into the frame. With a sharp metallic click, the lock gave way. He eased the door open, just enough to slip his body through. The interior air was still heavy with the scent of stagnant perfume and expensive wax. He did not rush. He moved across the thick carpet, his weight distributed to avoid the floorboards that might groan under his step. Every movement was a calculation, a slow shift of center of gravity. He passed the heavy oak desk and the velvet chairs, eyes locked on the small table beside the bed. Juma lay in the center of the mattress, his breathing deep and rhythmic. The antique phone rested on the wood, reflecting the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. Musa stopped. He held his breath, listening to the house, listening to the man's steady inhale. He crouched, lowering his hand toward the table surface. His fingers hovered inches away from the cold metal of the device. The shadows of the room seemed to pull tight around him, masking his silhouette as he prepared to strike. Musa's fingertips brushed the cool, textured surface of the phone. At that exact second, Juma shifted, his shoulder pressing deep into the pillow. The bed frame let out a sharp, rhythmic creak. Musa froze. He remained perfectly still, his hand hovering over the wood, his eyes fixed on the rise and fall of the man's chest. The seconds stretched, heavy and suffocating. Juma exhaled a long, ragged breath, his muscles relaxing back into the mattress. Musa did not wait for a second chance. He slid his palm beneath the phone, lifting it with practiced, feather-light precision. The device felt dense, colder than the air around it. He drew his hand back, pulling the phone into his chest. He stood straight, his eyes scanning the room one last time to ensure nothing had been disturbed. The room remained silent. He turned, his boots finding the same path back to the terrace, careful to avoid the center of the floorboards. He stepped through the threshold and into the night, the weight of the stolen prize firm in his grip. Behind him, the room remained locked in stillness, the man on the bed still anchored to his dreams, unaware that his entire world had just been dismantled. Musa pulled the sedan door open and slid into the passenger seat. He did not speak. He simply opened his palm, revealing the phone resting against his skin. The streetlights flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the interior of the car. Bosi Kasim reached out. His fingers closed around the device, pulling it into the light of the dashboard. He turned it over, his thumb tracing the edges of the casing. For a heartbeat, he sat motionless, his breathing shallow. He looked at the screen, which remained dark, and then at Musa. A slow, jagged smile spread across his face, revealing teeth that caught the faint, orange glow of the city. He felt the density of the metal, a strange, unnatural chill that radiated from the surface. This was not just a tool. It was the leverage he had spent weeks hunting. He pressed his palm flat against the back of the phone, his knuckles turning white as he gripped it with both hands. His eyes widened, fixed on the black glass, as if he were already seeing the empire he would rebuild for himself. He leaned back into the shadows of the seat, the device held against his chest like a weapon. He nodded once, a gesture of absolute, ruthless certainty. The game had shifted. The power was finally in his hands. Kasim did not wait for the car to move. He tapped the glass screen with his fingernail. Nothing. He pressed his thumb against the center, applying heavy pressure until his nail bed turned white. Still nothing. He shook the device. the metal frame rattling against his palm. His breathing quickened, the rhythm turning erratic. He brought the phone inches from his lips, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly snarl. "Listen to me," he commanded, the words sharp against the confined space of the sedan. He demanded gold. He demanded the deeds to every building in the city. He demanded absolute power over the markets and the streets. His voice climbed, reaching a fever pitch as he listed his desires, his tone hardening with every syllable. He barked orders for influence, for status, for the total submission of everyone who had ever defied him. He waved his free hand in the air, gesturing toward the city skyline as if he were already claiming it. He hammered his fist against the seat, his face flushed with the exertion of his own greed. He pressed the phone tighter to his ear, waiting for the sound of a response, his eyes darting across the dark glass, desperate for the first sign of compliance. The final command died in the air, leaving only the sound of heavy, ragged breathing inside the sedan. Kasim froze, his ear pressed against the cold metal casing. He waited. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Outside, the city traffic hummed, but inside the car there was only the static of his own rising dread. He pulled the phone away and held it at arm's length. The screen was a black mirror, reflecting nothing but the dim lights of the dashboard. No flicker, no pulse of light, no hum of electricity. He tapped the glass again, his touch lighter this time, almost hesitant. He turned it over, searching for a battery port or a hidden switch, but the surface was seamless, smooth as polished stone. He shook it violently, listening for any internal movement, but the device remained inert, heavy as a dead weight in his palm. His heartbeat hammered against his ribs. He looked at Musa, his eyes wide and unblinking, but his henchman sat rigid, staring straight ahead. Kasim felt the temperature drop, a sharp, biting chill radiating from the phone into his hand. He looked back at the screen. It was not just off. It felt empty. A profound, hollow void stared back at him, defying his command and ignoring his reach. The power he had claimed was slipping away into the dark. The phone in Kasim's hand began to hum. It was a low, resonant frequency that vibrated through his palm and up his arm, making his fingers ache. He tried to drop it, but his muscles locked, forcing his grip to tighten. From the center of the dark glass, a sound emerged. It was not a digital tone or a synthesized signal. It was a voice, hollow and resonant, as if echoing from the bottom of a deep well. It filled the cabin, bypassing his ears and vibrating directly into his skull. The voice did not offer wealth. It did not acknowledge his status or his threats. It spoke a single, measured sentence that sliced through the air. "This device serves only the pure of heart." The words hung in the cramped space, heavy and final. Kasim stumbled back against the upholstery, the phone suddenly feeling like a burning coal. He scrambled to find a retort, his jaw working, but no sound came out. The rejection was absolute. The authority he had craved was not merely withheld. It was stripped away, leaving him exposed in the dim light of the sedan. His eyes remained fixed on the phone, watching as the faint vibration ceased, leaving the device as cold and empty as it had been before. The silence that followed was no longer just quiet. It was a verdict. Kasim snapped. The shock of the voice dissolved into a white-hot fury that surged through his chest. He stood up, his knees hitting the steering wheel, and let out a guttural roar that shattered the cabin's stillness. He did not think. He only felt the burning need to break the object that had defied him. He snatched the phone back from the seat, his knuckles white, and twisted his body toward the interior wall of the vehicle. His arm drew back, muscles corded with tension, and he slammed the device against the hard metal surface with every ounce of his remaining strength. The impact was sharp and jarring. The device hit the wall, ricocheted off the frame, and skittered across the floorboards. Kasim lunged after it, his breath coming in jagged, desperate gasps. He kicked at it, his boot connecting with a dull thud, but the device did not shatter. Instead, it hummed once a sharp, discordant note that vibrated through the floor. The air inside the car began to warp, the light bending around the phone as if pulled into a vortex. The walls of the sedan groaned, the metal groaning under an impossible pressure, as the reality Kasim had bought began to buckle and fray at the edges. The distortion did not stop at the car. It surged outward, a wave of shimmering instability that tore through the opulence of the mansion. The walls began to peel away, not like paint, but like layers of smoke dissolving in a strong wind. Fine marble surfaces turned to dust, drifting away into the dark, empty night. The luxury car, sitting in the driveway, was the first to succumb. Its steel frame softened, warped, and then simply evaporated, leaving behind only the cold, hard ground where it had stood. The grand windows shattered, but there was no glass on the floor. The fragments vanished before they could touch the earth. Everything Juma had built was being unmade by the same force that had summoned it. The polished floors buckled, revealing the dirt beneath. Chandeliers flickered, dimmed, and turned into shadows that pulled apart into nothingness. The air thrummed with a low, dissonant vibration that shook the foundation of the house. With a final, sickening groan of failing reality, the ceiling gave way, collapsing into a cloud of gray mist. The grand estate shriveled, the grandeur bleeding out into the darkness until the horizon was empty once more. In the wake of the vanishing magic, the familiar, weathered silhouette of the old shack emerged from the wreckage, standing alone under the indifferent sky. Juma gasped, his lungs burning with a sudden intake of stale, humid air. He pushed himself upright, his palms scraping against dirt-packed earth instead of polished mahogany. The transition was violent, a sensory reversal that left him disoriented and shivering. He blinked against the darkness, waiting for the familiar hum of the mansion, but only heard the rhythmic drumming of rain against a rusted corrugated roof. He reached out to his left, fingers searching for the edge of a soft mattress, but found only the cold, uneven planks of the floor. The air felt heavy, saturated with the scent of damp wood and stagnant water. He stood up, his legs shaking, and his head brushed against the low ceiling. Every detail he had known, the fine linens, the open space, the scent of expensive incense was gone. In their place, the shack stood small and suffocating, its walls weeping moisture. He pressed his hand against the wall, feeling the splintered timber beneath his skin. The silence of the night was absolute, broken only by the drip of rainwater into a bucket. He looked down at his own hands, searching for a trace of the life he had held moments ago, but found only the calloused palms he had always possessed. The fortune was gone. The security had evaporated. He sat back down on the hard floor, the weight of the reality pressing into his spine, and let the truth of his return sink into the marrow of his bones. Juma remained on the floor for a long time, his gaze fixed on the corner where the shadow gathered. He moved his hands across the dirt, fingers digging into the dust, searching for the smooth, cold surface of the phone. It was nowhere. He stood up, his movements stiff and heavy, and paced the 3 short steps that defined the width of the shack. He checked the pockets of his old trousers, finding only a stray piece of lint and a pebble. The luxury was gone, leaving behind a void that felt sharper than the cold. Outside, the rain continued to beat against the metal roof, the sound no longer a background noise but a reminder of the storm he had lived through. He looked at the cooking pots in the corner, dull and empty, reflecting none of the light he had grown accustomed to. The realization settled in his chest, heavy as stone. The fortune had not been a step forward, but a brief, cruel deviation. He walked to the door and pushed it open, looking out at the murky puddles and the gray, featureless night. There was no mansion, no car, no path back to the heights he had occupied. He gripped the doorframe, his knuckles pale, and stared into the dark. The dream had been a flicker of light in a long, unbroken night, and now the darkness was absolute once more. Juma pulled a borrowed, battered mobile device from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the names he had called only yesterday. He dialed the first number, an investor who had once praised his vision. The line clicked. A hollow ring echoed, and then went dead. He tried again. The call was rejected. He scrolled through the list, dialing each name in turn, but every attempt ended in silence or a mechanical busy signal. He stepped out of the shack into the morning light, walking toward the district where he had held court. He reached the heavy glass doors of the club where he had celebrated his peak. The doorman, who had previously bowed as he passed, stood motionless, arms crossed, blocking the entrance. Juma spoke, but the man did not look at him. He stared past his shoulder, eyes glassy and indifferent. Juma moved to the next shop, the next office, the next contact. At every turn, the result was the same. The people he had dined with, the partners who had toasted his success, now looked through him as if he were made of smoke. His status had vanished, and with it, the artificial warmth of their interest. He turned away from the glass facade, his reflection looking back at him. A man standing in the street, unrecognized and entirely alone. Juma walked back to the edge of the district, his boots dragging through the thick gray mud. The shack loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette against the low, heavy clouds. He reached the door and leaned his forehead against the damp wood, closing his eyes against the reality of his surroundings. He expected nothing. He had spent the morning learning that the city had no room for a man without a fortune. He heard a sound, not the distant hum of traffic, but the distinct, rhythmic crunch of footsteps on gravel. He stiffened, bracing for another dismissive glance or a sharp word from a passerby. He turned slowly, his hand gripping the doorframe. A figure moved through the mist, steady and purposeful. It was Alima. She did not stop at the edge of the path or look away as the others had. She kept walking until the distance between them vanished. She stood before him, her face unshielded from the damp chill, her eyes searching his. The air felt different as she approached, the oppressive silence of his isolation breaking. Juma stood motionless, watching her. She did not speak, but her presence was a physical weight, a tether pulling him back to the ground. He stepped aside, opening the door wider, and she followed him into the dim space of the shack. The interior of the shack remained cold, the smell of damp earth clinging to the walls. Alima did not look at the peeling paint or the hollowed-out space where his luxury items had been. She walked to the center of the room and placed a woven basket on the rickety wooden table. It was heavy, filled with oranges and dark, ripened bananas. The vibrant colors sat starkly against the splintered wood of the table. Juma watched her hands, calloused and steady, as she smoothed the fabric of the basket cover. She did not mention the vanished cars or the empty bank accounts. She reached out, her fingers catching his, and pulled him toward the stool beside her. The contact was firm and warm. She sat, gestured for him to do the same, and broke a piece of fruit, offering it to him without a word. Juma took it, the weight of the moment settling in his chest. Outside, the rain continued to beat a rhythm against the roof, but the atmosphere inside had shifted. The silence was no longer heavy with loss. It was filled with the quiet, deliberate pace of shared existence. She sat with him, ignoring the ruins of his former life, her focus entirely on the simple reality of the fruit between them. 100 yards away, Bosi Kasim leaned against the rusted frame of his sedan. He watched the shack through the rain-slicked windshield. The interior light flickered, casting a silhouette of two figures sitting close together against the wall. He recognized the movement of her head, the way she leaned into Juma. Kasim gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white until the leather groaned. He could not accept that the man he had dismantled still possessed the one thing he had failed to buy. He watched them share the fruit, the simplicity of the act provoking a jagged, rhythmic twitch in his jaw. He reached into the passenger seat and pulled out a heavy glass bottle, smashing it against the dashboard. The sound was sharp, cutting through the steady roar of the storm. He stared at the broken glass, his eyes fixed on the shack. He didn't care about the money anymore. He didn't care about the power. He wanted the connection between them severed. He stepped out of the car, the cold rain soaking his shoulders, and reached into his pocket. His fingers closed around the jagged edge of a lighter. He turned his gaze toward the shack one last time, his mouth set in a thin, rigid line, and began to walk. Kasim moved with a heavy, deliberate gait, boots sinking into the saturated ground. He ignored the mud splattering against his shins. The rain hammered the earth, but he shielded his movements behind the low-hanging branches of a nearby thicket. He reached the rear of the shack, where the siding was brittle and dry despite the downpour. He stooped low, scavenging for discarded wood and oily rags piled against the foundation. He pulled a bundle of dry tinder from beneath a sheet of rusted, corrugated metal. His hands worked with mechanical precision, stacking the debris against the timber wall. He stood upright, his breath hitching in the cold air. He clicked the lighter. The flames sputtered, struggled, then caught a length of twine. He held the burning twine to the pile of rags and wood chips. Smoke curled into the air, mixing with the mist. He stepped back, watching the first orange tongues of fire lick the wood. He moved toward the front corner, shielding the growing flame with his body. He stood at the edge of the shack, the heat now radiating against his palms. Waiting for the structural integrity of the wall to surrender to the heat, Kasim swung his arm with a sharp, violent jerk, hurling the burning torch into the center of the pile. The dry tinder ignited instantly. A sharp hiss cut through the sound of the rain as the flames latched onto the oil-soaked rags. Bright orange light exploded outward, casting long, dancing shadows against the corrugated metal siding. Within seconds, the fire climbed the wooden support beams, turning the brittle timber into a glowing, skeletal frame. A low, rhythmic popping sound echoed from the wall as the wood began to char and split. The heat intensified, pushing back the damp air and creating a pocket of stifling, dry pressure. One of the primary support posts buckled, sending a shower of sparks into the dark sky. The fire roared, a hungry, living sound that drowned out the steady patter of the rain. Smoke began to curl beneath the roofline, heavy and gray, coiling like a serpent toward the rafters. The wall groaned as the fire ate through the structural joints. Kasim stood motionless, his face washed in flickering amber light, watching the inferno carve a path through the home. The roof shuddered under the mounting pressure of the blaze. Inside, the air turned opaque in seconds. The gray, stinging smoke poured down from the ceiling, hugging the floor and burning the back of Juma's throat. He bolted upright, his eyes watering, the world reduced to a haze of orange light and choking darkness. A loud, sharp crack tore through the room as the main beam splintered above the bed. Juma kicked the door, but the frame had already warped from the heat, jamming it shut against the exterior pressure. He dropped to his hands and knees, crawling beneath the thickest layer of smoke. He reached for the stool near the corner. It was empty. He shouted, but his lungs seized, forcing him into a violent coughing fit. He pressed his face against the damp dirt floor, gasping for the thin pocket of air beneath the soot. He felt a hand brush his shoulder. It was Mama Juma, huddled against the wall, her face obscured by the swirling debris. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the floor. The heat intensified, turning the room into a furnace. He braced his feet against a heavy pot, preparing to shoulder the door with everything he had left. The wall behind them buckled, the metal roof sagging inches lower. Juma braced his shoulder against the warped metal door and slammed his weight into it. The frame groaned, the wood around the hinges splintering with a sharp, dry snap. He struck it again, his boots sliding in the loose dirt. The door gave way, swinging outward into the rain. A massive, burning support beam crashed down from the ceiling, slamming into the ground between them and the exit. Sparks showered the floor, igniting the tattered bedding. Juma did not hesitate. He lunged through the wall of heat, his skin stinging as he reached for his mother. He hooked his arm firmly under her shoulders and hauled her upright. The air was a furnace now, thick with the smell of scorched timber and melting plastic. He dragged her across the debris-strewn floor, his lungs burning with every inhalation. He stepped over the smoldering beam, his foot catching on a jagged edge, but he kept his momentum. He shoved her through the open door, tumbling out into the cooling rain just as the metal roof above them buckled. The entire structure shuddered, the walls leaning inward as the joints gave way. He pulled her further into the mud, rolling away from the foundation as the timber frame collapsed. The corrugated metal shrieked as it folded, the entire frame collapsing inward with a heavy, final thud. A plume of white-hot sparks erupted into the night sky, hissing as they met the relentless downpour. Juma remained on his knees in the mud, his chest heaving, watching as the remains of the shack turned into a pile of twisted, glowing scrap. The heat that had filled the room vanished, replaced by the biting chill of the rain. He looked at the smoking debris, his hands still trembling from the exertion. Pieces of charred wood shifted, settling into the cooling embers. Mama Juma sat beside him, her breathing ragged, her eyes fixed on the fire. There was no sound now except for the rhythmic drumming of rain against the ruins. The structure that had held their lives for years was gone, reduced to a smoldering footprint in the earth. Juma reached out, his fingers brushing the wet ground, then stood up slowly. He did not look back at the wreckage. He turned his face toward the dark alley, his stance firm, the rain washing the soot from his skin. The fire was dead, but the ground beneath his feet remained. Kasim stood a few paces from the wreckage, his gaze fixed on the smoldering ruins. He took a step backward, eyes darting toward the narrow street, searching for an exit. He did not see the three men flanking him from the shadows. A neighbor lunged, catching Kasim by the shoulder and spinning him around. Kasim shoved back, his heels digging into the mud, but he was outnumbered. Two more residents joined the fray, pinning his arms to his sides. He thrashed, his boots kicking up sprays of wet earth, but they held their grip, locking his wrists behind his back. The struggle drew others from the surrounding shacks. They formed a tight, silent circle around the captive. Kasim hissed a string of threats, but the men ignored him, pressing his face into the damp soil until he stilled. A set of headlights cut through the rain, sweeping across the alley walls. A patrol car slowed to a halt at the corner. Officers stepped out, their boots heavy on the pavement. The neighbors pulled Kasim to his feet and shoved him forward, meeting the approaching authorities. The cycle of malice halted as the heavy steel doors of the vehicle clanged shut, securing him inside. The rain continued to fall, but the heat from the ruins had vanished. A thick, gray column of smoke lingered over the pile of ash, refusing to dissipate in the wind. Juma stood still, his arm around Alima, watching the vapor swirl toward the center of the clearing. The air grew heavy, static electricity prickling against his skin. The smoke did not drift away. It condensed, thickening into a dense, vertical wall. Then, the center of the haze parted. The old man stood in the space where the wall of the shack had been. He did not look like he had been touched by the fire or the storm. His feet rested on the wet earth without sinking into the mud. He looked at the wreckage, then shifted his gaze to Juma. There was no judgment in his expression, only a steady, quiet awareness. He did not speak. He simply stood, a dark silhouette against the dying embers, his presence anchoring the space between the ruins and the street. Juma held his ground, his grip on Alima tightening slightly. The old man tilted his head, his eyes tracing the line of the destroyed home, then returned his focus to Juma. The silence stretched, filled only by the falling rain. Juma reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the metal casing of the phone. It felt unnaturally cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the evening air and the heat still radiating from the cooling embers. He pulled the device out. The screen remained dark, a flat obsidian surface that reflected nothing. He took a step forward, his boots crunching on the charred timber. The old man watched him, his posture rigid and still. Juma extended his arm. He pressed the phone into the old man's open palm. The contact was brief. As soon as the weight of the device left Juma's hand, his shoulder dropped, the tension of the last few days draining from his frame. He did not look back at the ruins. He kept his eyes fixed on the man, waiting for a response. The old man closed his fingers around the phone, his grip firm. He nodded once, a sharp, singular motion. The air between them hummed with a low vibration. Juma stepped back, rejoining Alima. He stood with his feet planted firmly on the ground, his gaze steady, finally free from the burden of the object he had returned. The phone began to pulse. A faint, rhythmic light bled from the edges of the casing, turning the metal white. It did not melt, but rather unraveled, the physical structure loosening into individual threads of luminescence. Juma watched as the device lost its density. It hovered just above the old man's palm, spinning slowly. Then, with a sound like a soft intake of breath, the object shattered into 1,000 golden sparks. They rose upward, spiraling into the dark sky, casting long, flickering shadows against the remains of the shack. The sparks drifted higher, catching the moisture in the air until they dimmed into nothingness. The old man watched them go, his head tilted toward the clouds. He turned his palms upward, empty and clean. The air grew still. The unnatural weight that had pressed down on the clearing throughout the night vanished. Juma stood on the solid ground, his breathing even. Beside him, Alima remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the empty space where the sparks had vanished. The ruins of the shack were silent. No hum remained. No phantom energy lingered in the night. The connection to the extraordinary had been severed, leaving only the damp earth, the smell of charred wood, and the quiet rhythm of the city waking up in the distance. The morning air was thin and cool. Juma walked through the quiet streets, his pace steady and deliberate. Beside him, Alima carried a crate of oranges, the wood biting slightly into her palms. They reached the designated corner where the pavement met the shade of an overhanging wall. Juma set his burden down with a heavy thud. He wiped his hands on his trousers and began to stack the empty crates into a makeshift counter. He placed a wooden plank across the top, testing its weight with a firm downward press. Alima followed his rhythm, arranging apples and mangoes in neat, symmetrical rows. The skin of the fruit was firm and cool under their touch. They worked in silence, the only sound the scrape of wood against stone and the soft thud of produce settling into place. Juma moved a basket to the center, centering it until the alignment was perfect. He stepped back, observing the small stall. It was simple, solid, and built by their own hands. The first rays of light crawled over the horizon, catching the dew on the fruit and turning the dull colors into vibrant shades of gold and red. The city began to stir, but for a moment, the space around the stall remained theirs alone. The sun cleared the buildings, casting long, sharp shadows across the street. The orange glow intensified, washing the pavement in a warmth that chased away the last chill of the night. A low hum of activity drifted from the harbor, joined by the rhythmic clatter of carts on cobblestones. The city was waking up, vibrant and loud. Juma leaned against the stall, his eyes tracking the movement of a neighbor opening a shop across the road. He looked at the fruit, then at Alima, who was busy polishing a single apple with a cloth. A passerby paused, squinted at the display, and stepped forward to inspect the produce. Juma stood upright, his posture relaxed, and offered a nod of greeting. The transaction was simple, a brief exchange of coins for goods, marked by the honest weight of the fruit in the customer's hands. There was no magic here, only the steady pulse of a day earned through effort. The light climbed higher, flooding the market square and illuminating the rooftops of the sprawling city. Juma stood his ground, shoulder to shoulder with Alima, as the morning sun reached its full height, signaling a future built on their own terms.